Okay, so welcome to week 3 of the medical ethics course. Can everybody mute, please? That isn't already muted. I'd like to dedicate this session to a refuah shlema for 3 people: Rabbi Sachs, Harav Yaakov Tzvi ben Liba, Diane Ehrentreu, Harav Chanoch HaKohen ben Blimela, and a little baby who is the great-grandchild of somebody in our community who's having an operation on a hole in the heart tomorrow, Hatinok Ayal ben Zahava Penina. They should all have a refuah shlema, and the learning that we do tonight should be in their zechut for a refuah shlema. Right. I hope that those of you who received the worksheet have it available. If not, do not worry, because I'm going to share my screen with you and we will go through it together. So let me see if I can do that successfully. How are we doing with that? Can we see the screen? Yes, excellent. Right, so let's just have a look at this list here. We've seen this list before. This is the list of principles of medical ethics, which many people consider to be the main ethical principles. There are various different lists, as we spoke about before. This is a list which is what I consider to be fairly comprehensive. And if we get through all of this, I think we'll have a reasonable introduction to the idea of medical ethics. So we spoke about beneficence and non-maleficence in the first week, and we spoke about autonomy, and we touched on consent last week. What I want to concentrate on today is truth-telling. Now, at first glance, that might be pretty obvious. You might say, well, that's obvious, isn't it? Of course you've got to tell the truth. But I would suggest to you that it's not as straightforward as it might seem. And I'm hoping as we go through this tonight, you'll get some ideas as to where the dilemmas arise with the idea of telling the truth. So let's go through the worksheet together and see what comes up. We are going to do a breakout into the rooms after a little while and discuss one or both of the cases that I sent out to you. So bear those cases in mind as we go through these ideas on the worksheet. If anybody has any absolute burning issues that they want to raise as we go through, then press your raise hand icon. Those of you who've got questions that can wait till the end, then do so, please. So, the truth. As anybody working in the healthcare industry, if we'll call it that, profession, we're expected to tell the truth. I mean, that's a given, really. We're meant to tell the truth to patients simply because, well, that's the right thing to do, isn't it? Telling the truth's important. But sometimes there are demands on us which make us stop and think, do we have to tell the truth in this situation? Should we tell the truth? Do we have to tell the whole truth? Can we tell a partial truth? And what are the features that might weigh on our consciences when we're making that decision? So we all have to tell the truth as human beings. The truth is a good thing, but I think most people would agree that it seems that there is a particular moral obligation when you are in a position of a health carer and you're dealing with a patient who is very much if you like, for want of a better phrase, in your care or at your mercy, that telling the truth in that professional relationship is extremely important. So if there are reasons for not telling the truth, we need to know what they are. And when would it be justified not to tell the truth? And when would it be justified to partially tell the truth? So we spoke in the week 1 about the idea of beneficence and non-maleficence, meaning it is our obligation, and I showed you in the Hippocratic Oath and the new oath that young American doctors, some of them at least, take, that we promise to do our best not to harm patients. And that was really, in the past, probably the #1 ethical value that was drummed into doctors, nurses, health carers, professionals of all sorts, was that the idea of non-maleficence, not doing harm to the people in your care, was paramount and overrode everything else, including the moral obligation to tell the truth. So therefore, at that time, I'm talking about in the past, we'll perhaps talk about what I mean by the past, but in the past, it was acceptable not to always tell the truth on the basis that sometimes telling the truth would cause harm to the patient. And if you might cause harm to the patient, then that potential to cause harm overrode the obligation to tell the truth. So in other words, if you had a balance of two ideas, then it would be in favor, the balance would be in favor of not doing harm rather than not telling the truth. But today, I think things have changed. Things have changed considerably. And actually, the idea of telling the truth or not telling the truth has, in my view, overtaken the concept of non-maleficence as being the #1 ethical value which is valued. That, together with autonomy that we spoke about last week, autonomy and telling the truth are very much bound together, as we will see shortly. And in recent years, and I suppose, what do I mean by in recent years? Well, I think during the lifetime of my career, for sure. So certainly in the last 30 years, there has been a change. Maybe less than that, maybe it's 20 years. But certainly in the last 30 years, there has been a paradigm shift, in my view, towards the idea that autonomy and telling the truth is something which is very difficult to override, much more difficult than it was. And I've written down here some of the ideas that those who believe that the value of telling the truth in healthcare is sacrosanct and of the utmost importance. These are some of the arguments that they would put forward. After this, we're going to go and look at the other side of the coin. So those of you who don't agree with some of these things, hold your horses, because you'll probably agree with more with a later section in this presentation. So the first thing is, and you'll see, if you can see on the page, I have deliberately done in bold some of the words, and you can see that the words that I've done in bold are words that are probably familiar to you from last week: autonomy, autonomous individuals, respect. This is these are the big things. So if you're going to be truthful, then by being truthful, you're respecting the person and enabling them to make a decision. We spoke last week about the idea of people making decisions for themselves even if we thought those decisions were wrong. We might even think those decisions were crazy. But nevertheless, in Western society, the idea that people have autonomy to make their decisions of their own volition is very, very important. Now, a person cannot make an informed decision and be autonomous in their decision making unless they have the information they require. And that means that the people who have information about them and about their treatment and about their lives, they have to be truthful and tell the patients in their care the truth about their conditions. So in other words, if a person is asked to make a decision about a treatment that they may or may not want to have, they can't make that decision if you withhold the truth from them. So it's showing a lack of respect to a patient not to give them that information. You're not respecting their autonomy. You're not respecting their intelligence to make the decision for themselves unless you are truthful and tell them the information that you have and share it with them. So lying is held to be a breach of the autonomy of the person. And this contradicts concepts such as patient empowerment, shared decision-making, and patient-centered care. Remember, we spoke about this right at the beginning of our first session. We spoke about the idea of a paternalistic doctor and a more patient-centered doctor of the modern era. My vintage was a bit on the cusp, a bit on the change, but I suppose I was probably more paternalistic than most. Those who are practicing younger than me, maybe 10, 15 years younger than me, certainly would have been drilled in this idea of shared decision-making and patient-centered care. Now, if you don't tell them the information, they can't do that. So that is a breach of that sacred cow of autonomy. So this is very important when we talk about the various different treatments. We have to give them information and make sure that they have all the information they can to make that informed consent. And we spoke last week about the case in Scottish law of Montgomery, which clarified the idea that information had to be given to the patient so they could make their decisions. So that's respect. The second thing is trust. Trust, duty and trust. Now, it's very interesting. Immanuel Kant, who was probably one of the most famous philosophers in the 18th century, and he believed, and you can read this up, there's a very good summary of his approach here in this book here called The Doctrine of Virtue, which was published by Harper and Row. You can find it there online. He believed that even if it was harmful to a particular person, or even if it was harmful to humanity as a whole, then it was important to tell the truth. Lying could never be allowed, even if it was to the benefit of the individual or perceived benefit, and even if it was a perceived benefit to society. So what he says is that if you tell the truth, even if that truth will cause harm, well then that's, it's an accident. It's not designed. When you told that truth, you were not aiming to harm the person. So it was a byproduct. You told the truth, and by harming somebody by telling them the truth, that was, if you like, collateral damage. It was an accident. But the harm that results from telling a lie is deliberate. And according to Kant, that makes the liar responsible. And he further says that it doesn't make any difference whether it relates to another person's right to know, or even if it results in innocent people being harmed, So Kant would subscribe to the deontological point of view, and we mentioned this right at the beginning of week 1. I've copied it again for you there. That was on the handout in week 1, but I've recopied it here. Deontology is an approach to ethics that focuses on the rightness or wrongness of actions themselves, as opposed to the rightness or wrongness of the consequences of those actions. And if you remember, the example that I gave you back in week 1 was the doctor that comes out of the room after a patient has passed away, and the family said to them, did he go peacefully? And the deontological point of view, Kant would say it would be wrong to say he passed away peacefully when that wasn't the case, even though that would be kind to the family, and it might cause harm to the family to know that their loved one who had passed away in a not so peaceful manner. Kant says it doesn't matter. The overall and overarching issue, according to this approach, is that the truth is absolute, and lies can never be told despite the consequences of always telling the truth. So you could also say that if you don't tell the truth to a patient and then they find that out, you may well destroy that relationship forevermore. You will have betrayed the trust. However well-meaning you might have been in not telling the truth, it may be that this person will say to themselves, I can't trust this person to tell me the truth anymore. How do I now know, whatever they tell me, I've now got some kind of doubt in my mind whether they're telling me the truth. And that can be a very painful place to be for a patient who is in a health carer's care, to not be able to trust their doctor, their nurse, their health carer, whatever it is. So the idea of trust is something which has to be borne in mind very carefully. So there's respect for autonomy, there's the idea of trust, and then there is something which these ethicists would postulate. And you may have gathered by the way I've written this particular paragraph that I do not fall into this category. I don't agree with this. I'm putting this forward as a value which is postulated by some ethicists. It happens not to be my view, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to place it before you. And what they say is this, that actually there are physical and psychological benefits to telling the truth. The first of those benefits belongs to the patient, and they will tell you that patients who are well informed will collaborate better with their doctors. Those who know what's going on, what might be waiting for them in the wings, what might happen to them in the future with various treatments. Forewarned is forearmed, they would say. That if a patient is told the truth, then they will comply and collaborate with treatment in a better way. And there's also evidence to show that patients who know what their diagnosis is and know what their prognosis is are willing to tolerate side effects of treatment and pain of conditions more than those who don't know the diagnosis. And I think that makes a bit of logical sense, that particular point, because a person who, God forbid, has a bad illness and knows that with that bad illness comes pain, comes treatment which has side effects, at least they know why they've got pain. Some people who don't know the diagnosis, who the diagnosis has been hidden from them, who've got symptoms, are less likely to tolerate those symptoms because they don't know why they've got it, and they will be fearful. That's the argument there. So the reverse of that is also true. In the absence of disclosure, harm may result from not seeking treatment. So in other words, if you don't tell patients what they have and what they might have, then they may not seek treatment appropriately. And this is one of the problems we're seeing at the moment with corona, is that patients are not coming forward to their doctors with non-corona related illnesses because they're scared to go to the doctor because of catching corona. And so they're not seeking treatment. And they're not seeking treatment because they don't know the diagnosis. If they knew the diagnosis, if they knew the information, they would come forward and seek treatment. Another part of this idea is that by telling patients the truth, if that truth is an unpalatable truth, if it is that they are entering a terminal phase of their illness, then it allows them to plan. It allows them to plan their care. It allows them to plan their personal affairs, put their financial affairs, their family affairs in order, say their goodbyes, etc. This is a very important part of caring for people at the end of life, and we'll talk about that when we do in more detail when we do end of life issues. But putting your affairs in order is extremely important for many people. It's very hard for the people on the other end of it, the people who have to hear them putting their affairs in order. But nevertheless, very many people are appreciative of the opportunity to put their affairs in order, and that can't happen if you don't tell them the truth. And so these people would also say that there is psychological benefit in knowing the prognosis for the same ideas as we've said before. So if you, I suppose, conceal the diagnosis, if you don't tell the patients the truth, as often we did not in the early days of my career, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, we were certainly less forward in telling patients the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. As I said to you earlier on, this has changed over that period of time. Then, if we don't tell them that, then we may be, says this approach, we may be preventing them from having some kind of benefit from the knowledge of the information. And as I've written here, it may actually expose them to psychological distress. And then, of course, you've got the idea of keeping that pretense up. I remember my late father, Zichrono Livracha, he used to have one of his favorite sayings was a quote, I think from Walter Scott, but I'm stand corrected if I'm wrong. Oh, what a web of deceit we weave when at first we practice to deceive. In other words, you start with a lie and you get another lie and you get another lie and you get another lie, and before you know where you are, you don't know where you are. Concealment, once started, and even with good intentions, would probably have to be continued, and that's very stressful for all concerned, especially when this is something which you didn't really want to do in the first place. So I've given you some references here to have a look at if you want to expand on this. There's some evidence to support the notion that informing patients does not result in a greater incidence of anxiety, despair, sadness, depression, insomnia, or fear. That's from a study by Gold in Internal Medicine 2004. You can just copy and paste that reference that I've put in the thingy there, and just copy and paste it into Google, and you'll be able to see the whole paper. So that's on the one hand. But what about the counter argument? What I've called here the challenge of truth telling in healthcare. By the way, that's one of those modern words, the challenge. A child, when I was young, was badly behaved. Now he displays challenging behavior. So challenge is one of those words which means difficulties. And the challenge of truth-telling in healthcare, I've used that word advisedly because it is a challenge, because it's not as straightforward as at first it seems. So, for example, let's look at the reverse side of what we said before. We said before that one of the first important features in telling the truth is to respect the patient's right to know. But what about a patient's right not to know such a truth? Some people prefer not to be told or not to have the full information given to them, but rather they would have somebody else find that out for them and deal with it appropriately. It's less common today, but I think it's less common today because it's just not popular. It's not, it's not the thing to do. Certainly when I was a junior doctor, it was very common in hospital for patients not to want to know. And they'd say, doctor, don't tell me, I don't want to know. I don't want to know bad news. If you've got bad news, don't tell me. And that was not an uncommon scenario 30 years ago. And in those situations, you would have to respect that patient's wish not to know. So it's not always true to say that withholding the truth from a patient is destroying their autonomy. On the contrary, withholding the truth from them may be actually enabling their autonomy. They have made an autonomous decision not to know that particular truth. So, in other words, some people are happy not to be given the unpleasant information. And as I've written here in bold and underlined, the reason I've done that is because it's very important. We said last week how important autonomy is in Western society today. Well, autonomous individuals are free to use their autonomy as they see fit. As we said last week, you can choose not to have a treatment, however bonkers that choice may be. It's your choice. So if you choose not to have some information told to you, or if you see fit to delegate somebody else to receive that information for you, then that is you exercising your autonomy. And that is a decision that you ought to be able to make. Okay. So, an example, an elderly patient who's just undergone numerous blood tests would be exercising her right to making a decision by asking that the doctor discuss the results with her daughter and not herself. To force or exert the truthful information on someone who might not be ready to deal with that would not only damage the patient, but also damage the relationship between the patient, the family, and the carers. So it's this is a very, very good summary of that point by a chap called Sokol, who I'll talk to you about in a moment. And he says like this: successful deception may possibly infringe the patient's immediate autonomy, but does not mean it fails to respect the patient's overall autonomy. So he's making a distinction here between absolutes and immediacy. And I think that's a very important point. So would this violate or respect the patient's autonomy? That's a question you have to ask. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, does the patient want to know? Now, I'll give you an example which is a more frivolous type of example than we've been talking about up till now. What about a pregnant lady who goes to have her 20-week scan, and the sonographer is able to tell the lady and her partner, if he's there, the gender of the baby from the scan. Now, that's a piece of information that they may or may not want to know. Some people want to know what sex of baby they're having, and some people don't want to know. Now, if you go according to the Kantian approach and say, well, it's the truth, I have to tell you the truth. I have to tell you that this is a boy or this is a girl, and they didn't want to know that, then you violated their autonomous right not to know the sex of the baby until the birth. So it's a frivolous example, but what I'm using it to show you is that this is a decision that you have to make on the basis of a question you ask yourself. Does the patient want to know the piece of information that I am about to, or I am considering telling them? So the overriding point here is not the truth. The overriding point is the patient's wishes. So you have to respect the patient's right to know, but you also have to respect a patient's right not to know. And this is the rub, because that's where it's hard to find out. It's easy with the sex of a baby, because you can say to the lady before you put your scanner on, right, I'm going to do the scan now. If you want to know, I'll tell you. If you don't want to know, I won't tell you, and look away now. It's a bit like, when you had the news on before match of the day. If you didn't want to know the result of the match, look away now. You have a right not to know. So it's not always absolute. So earlier on, we said that in the Kantian argument, it was an absolute duty to tell the truth. But it could also be argued that actually truth-telling is only one of a number of obligations. We had our list earlier on at the beginning of the handout, our list of principles. And you've got a situation here where some of those principles may be in conflict with one another. So where there is a conflict with different obligations, you have to decide your priority of obligations. And this is particularly relevant, as we said at the beginning, to the idea of beneficence and non-maleficence, which are used to justify not telling the truth to patients. So should we therefore promote beneficence instead, whilst taking into account our primary duty not to harm patients? If illuminating the truth would cause harm, and a lie is told with the clear intention of achieving good, then can lying sometimes be morally justified? Kant would say no, because he subscribes to deontology. But the other side of the coin, remember we spoke about this in week 1, was the idea of consequentialism, horrible word. What it means is that the end justifies the means. So the decision to tell or not to tell the truth depends on the details of the clinical situation, and the doctor should decide which course of action might be least harmful in producing the best results for the patient, i.e. the end justifies the means. In our case, lying is justified on the basis that to do so will cause less harm to the patient than telling them the truth. And that's consequentialism. I've given you the definition of that again over here. So far, we've got two sides of the coin. Basically, deontology and consequentialism. Does the end justify the means, or is it an absolute wrong to tell lies? And now I'm going to give you a middle ground. The middle ground is not necessarily telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. This is something which I think some of you will relate to, that you can tell a patient, you can give a patient a true picture without necessarily going into all the details. And I think that's an important thing, because it's not always kind to tell patients the whole truth. Do you have to tell them all the gory details of the treatments that they're going to have? Or can you just give them a sort of rounded picture? Does that count as telling them the truth? Or would Kant say that I have to tell them absolutely everything, including all the nasty side effects that the treatment might give you in all its gory details? And then there's another issue. What about the utilitarian approach? Now, what do I mean by that? This is a new term to us. The utilitarian approach talks about the idea of doing the most possible good for society, even if that means harming an individual. So here's an example that I've given you here. Patients are not always necessarily told that novice doctors are performing treatments, nor are they informed of the risks associated with treatments performed by novice doctors. So you go into a hospital, particularly if it's a teaching hospital, and you're going to have junior doctors there. And of course, we would always want our operation done by the most senior chap or chapess to do our operation, because we think that the more experience they've got, the more likely it is they're going to do a good job. Who would want to be the first person to be a patient of a newly qualified surgeon? How did I ever get to do my first Brit Milah? Which idiot allowed me to do a Brit Milah, the first one I ever did, on their child? And who do you think that was? You're going to say me, aren't you? Well, you would be wrong, actually. It wasn't me, but I thought it would be. I thought I'm going to have to wait to have my own kid here before anybody's going to let me loose. As it so happens, it wasn't. I don't think that we could do what we did back then, 30 years ago, which was not tell the parents that I hadn't done one before and that this was my first one. I'm sure I had my teacher stood by me. He thought I was ready. I'd been training for a certain period of time. He thought I was ready. Not sure I thought I was ready. But nevertheless, he thought I was ready and he was there to supervise me. But he didn't say to the parents, oh, by the way, Dr. Lieberman's never done one before. It's okay, isn't it, if he carries on and does your precious little fellow's Brit? No, of course he didn't say that, because what do you think they're going to say? Absolutely not. So the utilitarian approach will say that if on every occasion that I was going to do my first Brit, that was said to the parent, I would never have ever done my first Brit, which means that I would never have become a Moel. And then when my teacher, who then came to retire, there'd be nobody to take over from him, because nobody would ever become a Moel, because you couldn't ever get your first one under your belt, as it were. So you don't tell. And it's the same in hospitals. You go into hospital hoping and thinking even that the consultant surgeon's going to do it for you. But what if it happens to be, by the way, don't ever need an operation in the UK on the 1st of August or the 1st of February, because that's when the doctors change over and the new ones come in and they haven't a clue. So what if you have your operation on the first week of August and it turns out that the person that does it actually is very, very junior? It's not something you would have allowed, but it's a greater benefit to society, because we have to train the juniors. The juniors will never become seniors if we don't train them. So the utilitarian approach is, you don't have to necessarily tell them the truth, because if you do, you will be harming society. You may not be harming that individual, but you may be harming society as a whole. And that's called a utilitarian approach. So, as I've written here, to disclose this would potentially discourage patient participation, reduce the learning of the profession, which would impact on future practice and treatment outcomes. Now, I've written this in capitals here because this is another example of where opinion has shifted in recent years. Nowadays, you would really have to tell the patient that this is the first one. If you didn't and something went wrong and you hadn't told them that this was a novice, you would have your backs to the wall. And this is another example of how this shift in opinion towards patient-centered care, away from paternalistic approach, and towards patient autonomy being key. This is another example. Here's another example for you, and then shortly we're going to get to the cases. Another example here. What about a nurse who puts a medication into a patient's food without telling them? This may be an elderly patient with dementia, something like that, whose behavior is difficult, challenging, aggressive, lashing out other residents in their home or to the staff. And could it be that the benefit of hiding a sedative in their food outweighs the harm of telling a lie or not telling the whole truth to a patient? So that's another suggestion here. It may be that that it would be more harmful to withhold the information and withhold the medication than to give it. So just to sum up the positions that we've produced here, that we've said to start with, is that the starting point is that healthcare professionals are expected to tell the truth. And that's based on the obvious idea that lying is wrong and it disrespects a person's autonomy to tell them lies. However, we need to bear in mind that there is also the right not to know as well as the right to know. And although the truth is an essential moral good, it sometimes comes into conflict with other essential moral goods, like beneficence, non-maleficence, and autonomy. And when that conflict arises, then it is a challenge on each individual case to balance those conflicting ideas, the idea of always telling the truth with the harm, potential harm or benefit of telling the truth or withholding the truth. So having considered the arguments, then it's not necessarily always obligatory to tell the truth. But what we must do is we must not disregard the importance of telling the truth. It must not become the norm not to tell the truth. It must become the exception not to tell the truth. And when we don't tell the truth, we must justify that and we must record it. We must record it because it goes against a basic ethical principle. And you may well need to justify your actions at a later date, and recording those actions as you do them in a contemporaneous fashion will make your life a lot easier if the whole thing goes pear-shaped and you have to justify the fact that you haven't told the truth. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour through the Western modern societal approach to telling the truth. I'm going to break you into groups to discuss these two cases. Last week, I was set a challenge to find out what Israeli law says about all these things. I have not risen to that challenge completely because I did try, but my Hebrew is legal Hebrew anyway, is not up to scratch. And it was very difficult to actually understand the stuff I could find on Israeli law. However, I thought about it carefully, and what we're really talking about is not law. Although I have spoken in some parts about UK law and American law, what we're talking really is about Western societal ethics, the ethics of science, the ethics of research, the ethics of behavior in the Western world. And it's clear that as far as those ethics are concerned, Israel aligns itself with the West. So the secular Israeli approach to scientific ethics is, as we have spoken, I don't think there's any significant difference between the ethics, the bioethics as they're called, in Israel as opposed to anywhere else. There are pockets, as we spoke, such as Shaare Tzedek Hospital, Laniado Hospital, which do take into account when making their decisions the Jewish view. But again, I stress that I don't know the Israeli law, but the Israeli ethics, and if you look at the ethical societies in Israel, they do align themselves with Western society. So although I haven't fulfilled my task fully, I hope that is at least clear where the Israeli secular society stands on the ethical issues. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the two cases that I gave you. Okay, case number one, a very simple case, tragic case. A car accident. A man in a car accident is badly injured. The rest of his family is killed. He regains consciousness and is critically ill and fighting for his life. And if he asks about his family as soon as he's regained consciousness, would lying to him be justified? What are you going to tell him? Does it make moral sense to tell him the truth that his wife and 3 daughters have been killed? And if you're going to not tell him that, at what point are you going to tell him the truth? At what point in his illness or at what point in his recovery? And also, would your decision be different if he was about to die? So those are the questions I want you to consider in question one. Sharon, I'll come to you in a sec. And of course, then when we've finished in the rooms, we're going to go through the Jewish view like we have done in the past. Case number two is slightly more complicated. It's a bit more wordy, but nevertheless, it's a very pertinent case. Can I ask whoever's not muted to mute, please, because I'm getting some feedback. Case number two is basically this. You can read it for yourself, but basically, a man is in end-stage renal failure, requires a transplant. His daughter comes forward to offer to donate a kidney. She is found to be a match for his kidney, but during the testing, it's found that she cannot possibly be his genetic daughter. At what point are you obliged, or are you obliged, to disclose that information to the father and the putative daughter, that they're not blood relatives? Do you have an obligation to do so? So the questions I've set you for this case is, what is the moral dilemma? What are the arguments in favor of disclosure? What are the arguments in favor of non-disclosure? And finally, I'm going to ask you, each of your groups, what would you do? There's no sitting on the fence here. What would you do? That's a question. And then afterwards, we'll come back and go through what the Jewish view on truth-telling is. So before I break you up into your groups, Sharon, you want to ask a question?
I just wanted to mention that there was a movie we saw this year called The Farewell, done by a Chinese-American woman who came from China to America and then was called back to China because her beloved grandmother, who is just this sparkly, amazing woman, has been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And there's a big tension between the daughter, who is Americanized and wants to say farewell to her grandmother, and the family, which forbids it and says we have to go on as though nothing happened. She knows she has it, we know she has it, but we mustn't talk about it. And it begins from there. And I commend it to everyone for seeing a real, a whole movie about just these concepts. And it ends very happily, by the way.
Great, thank you for that. It just does raise an issue here, and that is that of culture. I've spoken to you tonight about Western society, Western culture, which is predominant at the moment. But in certain cultures, China being one of them, Japan being another one of them, they have a whole different view of this. It's too broad a topic for me to go into different cultures as well. I'm dealing with two cultures that we are familiar with, that of the Western world that most of us have been brought up in, and that of the Jewish world that most of us have been brought up in. So I'm concentrating on those two, but the concept that Sharon has just brought up is definitely worth mentioning, and that is that there are different cultural views on this as well. Simon Nelson, you have your hand up. No, you don't? Okay, right. Now, let me break you up into your groups then. When you go into your groups, quickly decide whether you want to look at case 1 or case 2 or both, and get stuck in. It's now 5 to 9. I'm going to give you 15 minutes or so to discuss, and then we'll come back, hear a few groups' views, and then we'll talk about the Jewish view. So into your breakout rooms we go. When you get the message, just accept your breakout room, please.
I don't know whether you can see me or hear me. I don't know whether you can see or hear me. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Naomi, can you hear me? Hold on. Naomi, can you hear me?
Simon, can you hear me now? Good, I can't hear you. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
I can, but I don't know why you're not in a room.
I have Naomi West on my screen.
Naomi, can you hear us? Doesn't look like it. Let me see if I can place you in a room. I don't know how to do that. Let me just check.
Not to worry if you can't.
Well, you'll be a room on your own. Maybe you can discuss it with me then, Simon. I'm not in a room either.
I'm quite, if we can involve Naomi as well, I'm more than happy to.
I think actually Naomi is joined on 2 machines, and I think she's in another room. I don't think she can hear us, Simon.
Right. Okay.
So tell me what are your views? What are your initial thoughts?
Can I just ask you the question I was trying to ask initially, which was whether there is some form of codified.
Rena's here now. Rena, can you hear us?
Sorry, I had to just go for a minute. Well, a long minute.
Okay. So Simon and Rena are here now. Naomi's on a is in 2 different places. So forget Naomi on your group. This is a group of Simon and Rena and me.
Well, I've literally just joined. I heard the first 5 minutes, but carry on.
Okay, so here's the case then. 1 case to discuss. We're going to discuss the second case, Simon, all right?
Right.
So this is the case, Rena.
Yeah.
A man, he needs a kidney transplant. So his daughter comes along and says, I'll give you my kidney. They do the tests and they find out that the kidney matches the father. But actually, whilst doing the test, they find out that actually she's not his daughter.
Oh, should they lie?
The question is, should the transplant team, do they have an obligation to tell either of them, or both of them, or none of them, the truth? Do they have an obligation to tell them? Should they tell them? What is the advantages of telling them and the disadvantages? And bottom line, what would you do? Now, you've only just had a chance to think about that. So let's see what Simon thinks while you're thinking about what you think.
Can I just ask the preliminary question that I was hoping
Yes,
to
of course you can, Simon.
have you ask by way of clarification? Is there a codified and formal duty of candor when you're in practice as a clinician or a medic? I know
there is a formal duty of candor, as you know, when you do something wrong.
Right, but
Okay?
not until then.
Not until then. You have a duty of candor, Rena, means that you have to come clean. So if you mess up, you now have in British law anyway, you have a duty to say I mucked up. Okay. Most people, if they've got any sense, don't actually do that because it ends up on your desk typing up my reports. But there is officially a duty of candor, but that doesn't apply in this scenario. You don't have a duty of candor in that respect of the word candor.
Right. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. The moral dilemma, in answer to the first question, I presume, would be whether and to whom you would reveal the information in relation to the paternity issue.
Yes, that's correct. That's the dilemma that we have. Do we tell? And if we do tell, when do we tell? And how do we tell? And who do we tell? That's the dilemma.
I mean, it's not really anything to do with the medical case, though.
Okay, so now we're talking. So you're saying it's nothing to do with the case. So keep your mouth shut.
Well, not keep your mouth shut, but definitely do the transplant. As in, it's nothing to do with health. It's to do with social.
What if you did the transplant and then she finds out that she's not the daughter, and she says to the transplant team, you should have told me. If I'd have known that I wasn't his daughter, I wouldn't have given him my kidney. So now I'm left with 1 kidney and I've given it to a complete stranger. I hated him. I only gave it him out of duty because he was my father. If I'd have known he wasn't my father, I wouldn't have gone anywhere near it. You have a duty to have told me you breached that duty. That's the opposite. That's a possibility.
But the surgeon, the people who are doing the operation, they are there for a job that here's a donor and here's someone who needs the kidney. Why does it matter? As in, from their point of view, is what's the outside relationships or anything else got to do with one another?
Well,
they've got a case on their table. Here's a donor. Here's a patient. Do the operation from their
Simon, what do you say to that?
From my limited legal perspective, I would say that the paternity issue is really a side issue as such, that the purpose of the test was to assess the suitability between donor and donee. And therefore, as long as they are suitable from a clinical perspective, I would not disclose, unless I had to, I would not disclose the paternity information. Because presumably you wouldn't know about the quality of the relationship between putative father and putative daughter as such prior to the operation. You may or may not know.
Okay, well, let me just stop you there, because you would know, because part of the whole workup, what we call, before you get to this stage, is to do a psychosocial assessment. We don't just take people off the streets, you know, and if you look at the question itself, I gave you a little bit of psychosocial background here. I'll just read it to you. Psychosocial background is that Miss P is a full-time student with a part-time job. She lives with what she thought was her father and her stepmother. Miss P was born abroad and her parents were not married. When her parents separated, Mr. P immigrated to North America. That could be anywhere, but it just happens to be North America because that's where I found the case. With his daughter, Miss P has had no further contact with her birth mother. Mr. P married 6 years ago, and Miss P states that she has a good relationship with her father and stepmother. So there's all sorts of dilemmas here. Simon says that he would not tell. But what about my point that you are withholding a piece of information that is material to Miss P's decision-making process?
I can understand certainly where you're coming from, but from my own previous practice, I wouldn't have disclosed that information. Now, from my position, I appreciate it's very different from that of a clinical practitioner, and your obligation as such might be wider.
Thankfully, that's true, because they only get to you when we've finished with them. Simon was I don't know if you're still a coroner, Simon, or have you retired?
Now just on an occasional basis.
Right, so Simon is a coroner. So he's not in our position. He's the kind of person that we want to try and avoid. So yeah, okay. So. But
is the responsibility of the surgeon, not the patient who is lying in front of him, to get him right?
Okay, so
if you're talking about the actual surgeon, or you're talking about the whole team?
I'm talking about the whole team, the whole transplant team, because they work as a team. So what we can see is that there is a dilemma here. It's not so straightforward. And let's just try and go back a step. What could they have done before we got to this stage to make the decision process easier?
There couldn't have been an explanation as to the process as such, that in due course we will be obtaining those tests, which will or may not determine paternity. And if so, are you aware of the risks involved in going through that process?
And furthermore, do you want to know if we find out something strange? So having heard this case, if we were now to be part of a transplant team and writing up a protocol for working up a patient, that would be part of the protocol. And indeed, it is now part of the protocol, exactly for that reason, because this is such a difficult question. When I found this case, I read it up, and the guy that had written it up said that he, oscillated between telling and not telling for 2 years. And obviously he wasn't part of the transplant team. This was a case that he was dealing with as an ethicist. But that's how difficult it was, because there is no right and wrong answer here, because there are dangers on both sides. If you don't tell, and she then finds out, first of all, you've got a problem that the transplant team may have ruined their reputation as being trustworthy. That's number one. Maybe other patients won't trust them to go through with it. Secondly, as I said earlier, she may not have given him the kidney, and she may then have a legal case against you for taking her kidney without proper consent, because she didn't have informed consent as such, because you had a material piece of information that you withheld from her. Now, if she may well come along and say to a judge, had I known that he wasn't my father, I would not have done this. I now have a great big scar on my back. I have one kidney, blah, 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 blah. And she may well have a case against the transplant team. On the other hand, if they do tell, then as Rena has said, they may end up having a situation where a transplant does not go ahead because of that. A patient may die as a result of that. And they may also destroy a family, and a seemingly happy family from this last paragraph over here. That may get destroyed by the knowledge, and that might be a reason not to disclose. So I know you weren't here at the beginning, Rena, but Simon, you were, and we spoke about this balance between the absolute need to tell the truth and the benefit and the harm that might come to. And I think this case demonstrates very clearly this terrible dilemma. So have another little chat about it. I'm going to leave you.
Is there not some kind of answer in law of the kavanah of the like the kavanah was to make the guy better?
That would certainly be a mitigating factor. I'm not sure that if, let's say, they didn't tell and she found out and then sued them, I'm not sure in today's society whether that would be sufficient mitigation. What do you think, Simon?
I think in litigious society nowadays, certainly in the States, I don't know if it's the same in Israel, but I think that there might well be a successful claim against the trust or the hospital.
Yeah, it's a very difficult dilemma, but anyway, there you go.
Can I ask, is there now a uniformative approach in Israel? So does everyone that practices in this area of law adopt the same protocol as such?
Yes. Protocols are now written, and of course they're changed all the time because of cases that come up. Exactly, this case comes up and they think, oh, right, well, we need to put something in the protocol which would deal with this case.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to leave you to carry on discussing the first case if you want to, and I'll rejoin everybody in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan. Thank you.
I don't have the other case.
I'll read. It's very short, Rena. Can I just ask you, Rena, what your background is? Are you a clinician or a nurse?
I'm Johnny's daughter. I work for him.
My goodness. Right. Well, you know who I am now. Case one, let me tell you, which was a situation that was reported in the English press probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. So you may have seen it or not, I don't know. But it refers to a car accident where the father was badly injured and all family members were killed. And the badly injured man regains consciousness, was critically ill and fighting for his life. And the question really is, if this man were to ask about his family as soon as he had regained consciousness, would lying to him be justified? And beneath that question, it begs the further question, does it make moral sense to tell him the truth that his wife and 3 daughters have been killed? And then secondly, or thirdly, at what point in his illness or recovery would it be right or wrong to lie to him? Thirdly or fourthly, what about if he were about to die? And then finally, what is the Jewish view? Now, you're probably more up to date than I am as far as all of those factors are concerned. And I was only thinking of this situation before I even saw the question as to what a dilemma it must be, and how on earth. And the only thought that I had before I hear your thoughts is there a difference when you're dealing with an individual's own predicament as against the predicament of third parties, even if they are family members? Does the obligation change at all? Because I'd be minded to say, given that it may not affect him, you never know for sure, I'd be minded initially, certainly, not to tell him about the fate of the other family members, purely and simply for compassionate reasons at that stage until he was perhaps stronger. But I don't know what the halachic view would be, and of course I don't know what your view might be, or your dad's.
God, that's intense. I know someone had a similar scenario of a friend who was in a coma, and her mum passed away while she was in the coma. And when she woke up, her husband didn't know whether she should tell him straight away or not, and he actually decided to wait until she was strong enough. But that was a decision of the husband.
Yes.
That he obviously knows her well enough to know that she, and she appreciates it obviously now that she's well, and that she wasn't strong enough at the time, but he made that decision for her. When it's a doctor making that decision and you don't know the relationships and you don't know the person personally and their psychological state even beforehand, wow.
I don't know what the answer. I don't know what the answer is.
The Jewish approach, I could be wrong, but the halachic approach will always be for the benefit and the health. Like, health is most important. So if it was going to make this person's health increasingly worse due to that, then it would be the right thing not to say.
The difficulty is, I suppose, from my perspective, and again, your father would know from practice to a far greater extent than I could ever even suspect or hypothesize, is that do you ever really know when a person is at that tipping point that you may adversely affect him or not, as the case may be. I know with death, which I've dealt with quite extensively, and the concept of an expected death, I take the view that it's impossible to even use that term expected death, because you can never gauge when an individual might finally succumb. It can be days, weeks, or months, or years. And I don't know whether it's the same for someone who has suffered severe injuries, badly injuries, but nonetheless maybe his suffering may be alleviated by knowledge or not, as the case may be. I really don't know.
With the first week, were you here on the first week?
Yes.
Well, that was also a discussion about at what point is the tipping point. At what point is, unless it's 100% sure that it's death, then you have to give the benefit of, unless it's 100% sure not going to make this situation worse for the person who's ill, which you could never know what percentage, you never know.
That's right. I've certainly come across cases where the clinicians involved have been, in their own minds, 100% sure that the individual is going to recover, and then has suddenly taken a turn for the worse.
Yeah.
So can you ever be sure? But that again is for the clinicians. I don't know here. Are you a medic now?
No, just wait for my cat. Is this also a decision that is for a clinician to make? As in, is this man has nobody else, I guess there's no other next of kin to make that kind of decision?
It's suggesting, I think, that all the family, all the close family, I mean, it's a good point. His parents or his siblings may be able to, and presumably, as far as the halachic perspective, to consult a Rav. But
hi, Brian.
I think we may be going back now.
I think we're back.
Nice to chat with you anyway. All the best.
Okay, you ought to all start coming back shortly now in the next half a minute or so, and I will get on screen while you're doing that. I will get on screen the next thing. Here we go.
Johnny?
Yes.
I'm actually seeing Danny Limore tonight.
Oh, you're going to the...
I'll go to the Stanmore thing. My wife didn't hear it the first time, so I thought I'd go to it.
Right. Give him my best. Tell him we're missing him.
Yeah. I presume he's still in Poleg.
No, I don't think he is, actually. I think he's in South America, actually.
Oh, doing one of his jaunts.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask him I can't remember where the Ethiopians, which tribe the Ethiopians are supposed to have come from.
Dan.
Is it Dan?
Dan, yeah.
All right.
Right. Are we all back? I think we probably are. We've got 46 computers back. Okay, can you all hear me? Please just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Yes, excellent. Right. Can you also see the screen that says Truth Telling the Jewish View? No. Okay. Well, that's because I haven't shared my screen with you. That would be helpful if I did. How about now?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Jolly good. Right. Let's go through the Jewish view about telling the truth. Okay. We have lots of things in the Torah about telling the truth, don't we? Let's just whiz through a few of them. Yaakov Avinu. He is known as Ish Emet. He is known as a man of truth. Okay, but was he a man of truth? If you read the book of Sefer Bereshit, you will see that it appears that Jacob is anything but a man of truth. He didn't tell the truth to his father. He didn't tell his truth to the truth to his brother. In fact, you find lots of times where Jacob doesn't seem to tell the truth, and yet he's described as Ish Emet. So that's something, the first thing we just need to bear in mind, that truth appears not to be absolute when we are dealing with, at least dealing with Yaakov Avinu. Now, we have a mitzvah in the Torah. You'll find it in Shemot, chapter 23, Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Rena, can you sing it to us, please, from the Uncle, what was it? The Marvelous Midas Machine, that song called Midvar Sheker Tirchak. My kids are very familiar with that. They'll be able to sing it to you. Rena's muted, so you're not going to be able to hear her. But all of you with kids of my age, Avril, you'll be familiar with that, won't you? Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Well, this is where it comes from. It means distance yourself from falsehood. In other words, don't tell lies. And interestingly, this is the only Aveira in the Torah where the Torah tells us to distance ourselves from it. It doesn't just say don't do it. It says distance yourself from it. In other words, that implies just don't go anywhere near it. Don't even think about it. In other words, the slightest bit of untruth, stay away from it. And there are other places, there are plenty of places in the Gemara. I'm going to whiz through these. I'm going to send you out this handout when I send you the recording, or when Avril sends you the recording at least. So it'll all be there for you to look at in detail. But there are various places in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 97a. We will get there in our Gemara Shir in about 2045 at our current rate. It says there that if you're careful to speak truthfully, this is a segula for a long life. Well, I can tell you that I know lots of people who've lived a long time who don't tell the truth, so I'm not quite sure that that always works. But still, there you are. There's another Gemara in Sota that says there are 4 groups of people that do not merit the Shekhinah, and one of them is liars. So the Gemara there is very clear about it. Another Gemara in Psachim, 3 types of people that God despises, and one of them is those that say one thing whilst have completely different feelings in their hearts. In other words, they are not telling the truth. Another one in Mishlei tells us this is an important thing from a practical point of view, that when a person is accustomed to telling the truth, then people come to trust him. The pasuk says, "Svat emet tikon la'ad," a true tongue will be established forever, but somebody who's a habitual liar will never be trusted. Va'ad argi'ah lashon shaker, but a lying tongue just for a moment. In other words, somebody who is known to be a liar, they never get believed even when they are telling the truth, and that's just a practicality. So it's clear that on one level, the Torah is telling us, and the Gemara is telling us, Mishlei is telling us that telling the truth is very, very important. On the other hand, it's clear that our avot v'imahot did not always tell the truth, and therefore there must be some place for not telling the truth in the Torah. And let's have a look at that. Understanding the permissibility to lie. So we need to go back to our pasuk of Midvar Sheker Tirchok, because what we need to do is look at the rest of the pasuk. The pasuk says, Midvar Sheker Tirchok, v'nakiv tzadik al taharog, kilo atzdik rasha. Distance yourself from a false matter, and do not kill an innocent person or one who has been declared innocent, for I will not vindicate a guilty person. And what this means by what the Mefarshim tell us in explaining this pasuk, in connecting these two ideas of Midvar Sheker Tirchok and V'nakiv Tzadik al Tarog, means that it's forbidden to lie in a way that might cause death or harm to anyone. So in other words, if it doesn't cause harm to somebody, then al pi ha-Torah, midoraita, it might not be forbidden to tell a lie, as long as that lie does not cause harm to anybody. So that's our first caveat. So we do, though, on the other hand, have a midarabanan, a rabbinic law, which says you shouldn't even tell a white lie. And there's a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, which goes like this: V'ish b'reyehu yahatalu v'emet lo yedaberu limdu l'shonam daber sheker havar nilu. Indeed, they deceive one another and do not speak the truth. This is Yirmiyahu speaking about the depths to which Am Yisrael has sunk in his day. Indeed, they deceive one another and do not speak the truth. They have taught their tongue to speak lies. They commit iniquity until they are weary. Mishlei again. Distance falsehood and the lying word from me. Give me neither poverty nor wealth. Provide me my allotted bread. So again, al pi halacha d'Rabbanan, we shouldn't tell white lies either. Nevertheless, there are cases of extenuating circumstances where the Rabbanan said you are allowed to lie. And we're told there's a ritva on Ketubot that to promote peace, it's permitted to tell a lie, because it seems that if the ultimate goal of the lie is a positive one, then that's not prohibited. So Immanuel Kant would not agree, because he, of course, agrees with the deontological view that lying is wrong per se. So let's have some examples. So there's a Gemara in Yevamot, quotes this week's Sedra. In fact, this is a very, very pertinent this week's Sedra. We read in the beginning of Parshat Vayera, what happens is that Avraham gets the guests, the three angels come, and they say, where's Sarah, your wife? And he says she's in the tent. And they say, well, she's going to have a baby. And what happens is Sarah says to herself, Vatitzchak Sarah b'kirba leimor. Sarah laughed within herself to herself and said, Acharei veloti hayta li edna v'adoni zakein. I've become worn out. V'adoni zakein, my master, meaning Avraham, is an old man. How are we going to have a baby? I've got, I'm worn out. I've got shriveled up ovaries, and he's an old man. How are we going to have a baby? And she laughs. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gets a bit cross and says, why is she laughing? I can do whatever I want. I'm Hashem. And Hashem says to Avraham, look what he changes. Hashem does not tell the truth. Hashem says this. Lama ze tzachaka Sarah lemor ha'af umnan eleid va'ani zakanti. Why did Sarah laugh? Hashem says to Avraham. And she said, is it really true that I'll give birth, even though I am old? She never said that. She said, my master is old. But Hashem changed it. And Rashi there, famous Rashi, explains that Hashem changed Sarah's words. He did not report them truthfully in order not to hurt Abraham's feelings and in order not to disturb the Shalom Bayit between Avraham and Sarah. So Hashem himself demonstrates to us, according to Rashi at least, that it is permissible to tell a white lie if it is for a beneficial purpose. Another example, we've spoken about this in the past in various fora. Aaron is called Ohev Shalom V'rodef Shalom. Aaron is somebody who pursued peace. And we're told that how would he do this? He would find two people who'd had a row, and he would go to Ruvain and he would say, Shimon really wants to make up with you, but he's a bit embarrassed to make the first move. Why don't you make the first move? And then he goes to Shimon and he says, Reuven really wants to make up with you, but you know what? He's embarrassed to make the first move. Why don't you make the first move? And neither of that was true. Neither of those statements were true. But as a result of that, Reuven and Shimon make up, and that was what is known as Aharon being Rodef Shalom, and that is spoken about about Aaron as a very positive feature. So the fact that he was willing to tell a lie in order to promote peace is told to be a good thing. And the Rif in Baba Metzia, if you want to look it up, it's in Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. He actually goes further and says it's a mitzvah to tell a lie in that way. And he gives some examples here. So somebody who wants to be an anav, somebody wants to be a humble person, he can hide how clever he is and his knowledge. If he's asked certain things, do you know the whole of the Shas off by heart? Well, if you ask me, do I know the whole of Shas off by heart? I might be modest and say to you, no, I don't know the whole of Shas off by heart. I'm just being modest. Okay, if you believe that, you'll believe anything. But there you are. There are some people that may well be overly modest because don't tell a lie because they don't want to show off. And they may change the number two there. They may change the truth in order to maintain modesty. In other words, when I say modesty, I mean sniut, so that they don't have to speak about immodest things. Now, this is a very interesting one. Changing the truth in order to protect someone else from harm or inconvenience. So, for example, you go to somebody and he was a very gracious host, or somebody gave you a big donation for tzedakah. You may want to not tell everybody about this person's magnanimity, because otherwise he'll have a queue tomorrow of other people wanting to take advantage of his generosity. So that's a possibility about that. Now, a very interesting one here. I put this in bold because this is very important. In a similar vein, Professor Avraham Steinberg, who is today probably the most authoritative halachic opinion on Jewish medical ethics, he is the author of the Jewish Encyclopedia of Medical Ethics, an absolute magnum opus. I recommend it to everybody. It's available in Hebrew and in English. And he says that if a person has an incurable illness, and if informing him of this will be detrimental to his health, then it may be proper to withhold this information from him. So this is Professor Avraham Steinberg's view, which is a contemporary halachic view, that it is not always obligatory to tell the truth in situations like that. Here's a famous one. I don't know about you, but I think there are many people that may have fallen into this category. A white lie is said to protect someone from embarrassment. An example of this is that one may say that a bride is beautiful and gracious, even if she isn't particularly beautiful and gracious. So when your wife or husband says to you, "Do I look nice, darling?" then you must always say, "Yes, darling, of course you do," even if that may not be entirely true. Okay, so yes, Rachel, yes, you can give him a whack there. Okay, so and number 5 is an interesting one. You look white like a sheet. Well, that's not really true, is it? That's an exaggeration. You live 1,000,000 miles from here. No, you don't. You live round the corner. It just feels like it's 1,000,000 miles. So that's not telling the exact truth. But the Gemara does not consider that to be telling lies. So there are. It's very clear from a view of the Tanakh and a view of the Talmud that absolute truths are not necessarily absolute in the Jewish view. But there are exceptions to the exceptions. So in other words, if we have to tell a lie, then we should always try not to say an outright lie, but rather to tell half-truths. Now, at first glance, I had a bit of a problem with this because that's, well, I didn't really tell a lie. It was, it's all a bit, it's not, I don't like that whole idea of half-truths. But when I thought about it a bit more, I think it's really what we said earlier on, and that is that we should not get used to telling lies. It's what we say in the pasuk in Mishlei said, that once we get used to telling lies, that becomes part of our personality. And we should be like Yaakov Avinu. There is a very good perush of how Yaakov, when he deceived his father with the brachot, that if you analyze the language very carefully, you can make out a case for him only telling half lies, or actually telling half truths, as opposed to outright lies. For example, just to give you one quick example, Yitzchak says to him, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am Esav, your son." But if you put a comma in there, you can make it, "I am Esav, your son," or "I am." Esav is your son. I am who I am, and Esav is your son. So it depends where you put the comma. So there is a way out. No, I don't like it either, Avril. You can shake your head. I'm with you on that. But what I'm saying to you is that the Mefarshim that do that, I bet you like that, Paul, though. Paul would have been in favor of that. No, Paul's shaking his head as well. Okay, so anyway, the Mefarshim that use those expressions, what they're doing is they're not just doing a whitewash, which we don't like whitewash. What they're doing is they're trying to show us that if you have to tell a lie, then try and do it in a way which is not an outright lie. And then the Rabbanim say this, very interesting. And even in these cases, one should try to avoid lying to children. Never lie to a child unless it's absolutely necessary, because by doing so, you're actually training them that it's okay to lie. So if a child says to you, are we going to visit Saba and Safta tomorrow? And you say, well, maybe, and you know full well that you're not, then that's not great, because you're actually teaching a child that the truth may not be always important. You should always try to avoid lying to children. And again, this is the Mishlei idea. One should try not to lie on a constant basis. And this is important. The Magen Avraham says that even when you have to lie, you can only lie about things in the past, and you must not lie about things in the future. So saying, I will do such and such, even if it's in order to make peace. That's not a universal view, but that is the Magen Avraham's view. So just to sum up our Jewish view on telling the truth, at first glance, you would say truth is an absolute pillar of Judaism. Titen emet leYaakov, truth is given to Jacob. It's absolute truth. But then when we look at it, actually, Yaakov is described as Ish Emet, but he appears not to be. But the Torah doesn't lie, and therefore, if he's described as an Ish Emet, he must be an Ish Emet, which means that Emet is not absolute. There are times when truth is absolute, and we should do our very best, midvar sheket tirchak, and definitely when v'nakiv tzadik al tarov, when lying will bring harm to somebody, then it is an absolute forbidden. But when lying can bring benefit, then there are times when it is permissible to tell a lie when that brings benefit, which brings us full circle to where we started in the Western society's view of telling the truth, which is right over here, the idea of beneficence, non-maleficence, and truth-telling being in conflict. And whereas, like I said at the beginning, 30 years ago, probably the idea of autonomy was not quite so strong. The idea of beneficence and non-maleficence was stronger. We would have less hesitation in not telling the full truth. Today in Western society, bioethics stresses telling the truth more than it did before. But the Jewish view is not so out of kilter with, or the other way around, I should say. Modern society is not so out of kilter with the Jewish view, in that we have to make that decision. It's a balancing act between the harm and the benefit that would be done, as opposed to telling the absolute truth. It's clear from our little whiz through the Jewish view of telling the truth, that telling the truth is not the be-all and end-all. The Jewish view is not in line with Immanuel Kant. It is more in line with consequentialism, that the end can justify the means in certain situations, but it's not something that we should do lightly. It's something that we must take very seriously, and we must go out of our way to try and avoid it as best we can. So I will shut up and allow you to speak, to ask questions, make your points. Raise your hand icon if you would like to speak, and carry on. Those of you who've had enough, who are tired, want to go to bed, I wish you a good night, and I'll see you next week. Any comments, questions? Yes, Joseph, unmute. No, we can't hear you.
Hey,
There we go. Now we can hear
right.
you.
Okay. Couple of points that I'd like to make. Rabbi Bezel Herring wrote an article about this some years ago. It was published in a collection of recent rabbinical responsa. And his article essentially, I think, was a protest or against what you described, I think, very well as that strong trend over the last 20, 30 years in medicine to be absolutely truthful, no matter what the circumstances are. And he said, from the Jewish point of view, as he described it then, around 20 years ago or so, that we must never take away hope from people. And if telling somebody the full absolute truth would take away hope, that would not be something that would be approved of in Jewish law, in halacha. That's one thing. The other point that I would like to make briefly is that in the Shalosh Esrei Midot, emet, truth, is not before v'rav chesed. V'rav chesed comes before emet. Being full of loving kindness, caring, understanding, generosity is before emet.
Okay, thank you for that, Joseph. Two very, very good points there. The second point about Hashem Keil Rachum V'Chanon Erech Apayim. Yes, of course, it is emet is it's tempered and is qualified by the Rav Chesed, as you quite rightly say. I just want to pick up on the first point and tell you a little story from my own experience. I mentioned to you Professor Rabbi Avraham Steinberg. His predecessor as the senior halachic authority in Jewish medical ethics was Professor Avraham, who wrote Sfarim, one called the Nishmat Avraham, one called Lev Avraham. And Professor Avraham, I was very privileged to have Professor Avraham as my Rebbe. I had a direct line to him and asked him many questions over the years, and he taught me very, very many things. I was involved in putting on a medical ethics conference, I don't know, 25 years ago, maybe, in Manchester. It was a huge success. We had people from all over the world. Professor Avraham was one of the speakers we brought over from Israel. And he was asked a question in the plenary session: what would you do if you were a patient who was terminally ill, asked about his diagnosis and wanted to know, or asked you whether he was, whether he was terminally ill? And I'll never forget this, because Professor Avraham, though I don't know any of you know him, is a most quietly spoken man. He's a brilliant man. He's a genius. He's a quietly spoken man. He's the most modest man you could ever imagine. And he's quite a short man. He stood up, puffed out his chest, and said, "I will lie, I will lie, and I will lie again." And that is, you can see that Professor Steinberg, as I quoted to you on the other piece of paper before, and he maintains that view. And what you've said, Joseph, there accords with that view. And that was Professor Avraham, Lev Avraham, Nishmat Avraham. And he was absolutely clear in his mind that that's what he would do. I think that would be frowned upon in today's Western society, to take such a stringent and clear view on that. However, that is the Jewish view, remains the Jewish view, remains Professor Abraham's view. As far as I'm aware, and I'd be pretty certain that he hasn't changed his view, that remains, I think, the mainstream Jewish view today. Howard Epstein, please. Howard, you'll have to unmute, Howard. We can't hear you.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I look spookier than usual. We've got a power cut here. I was in a group with 3 doctors and somebody very experienced in the medical field. It was fascinating. I too thought truth would be absolute in the Jewish tradition. I found an article right up your street, Johnny, by Rabbi Dr. Louis Jacobs. Truth and lies in the Jewish tradition. Jewish moralist literature sets a high standard of truth telling, one not without exceptions. Absolutely fascinating. And I can give you the, I will give you the, there it is.
Okay, there it is for everybody.
Howard, do you want us to talk about the 2 examples that you gave or not?
Could you please send that that you've sent on the chat,
or
at least Avril, can you get hold of that? Make sure that everybody has that to look at. I'm interested in people's views on the thing. I didn't go into ask you to do it because we were running out of time. But those of you that are still here voluntarily, as it were. So anybody who would like to tell us what your group thought about the 2 cases, please go ahead. Howard, you start.
Can I deal with case 2 first of all? Because
yes,
we thought it was a no-brainer. Because if somebody's going to submit surgery, she has to give consent. It has to be informed consent. And to be informed, she needs to be told this is not her blood relative father. So we didn't think that one was terrible. We did talk about it quite a bit, but we didn't think it was terribly difficult in the end. Certainly not nearly as difficult as case 1.
Did you not
because with case 1,
think that? Let me just, before you go to case 1, let's just talk about case 2. I'm just going to mute you for the moment, Howard, so that we don't get background noise. So Howard says it's a no-brainer. Of course, we tell her because she's got to know the truth. Anybody disagree with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Hillary, go ahead, Hillary.
Okay, she was not tested for a genetic purpose. She was only tested to see if she was a match for the person she was donating to. There is absolutely nothing to be gained by her knowing, her father or her
family.
This man knowing, her mother, she was born abroad, her mother disappeared some time ago. You would only cause aggravation, not shalom bias. But technically, she wasn't tested for genetic reasons. She was tested to see if she was a match, and that we think means that they don't need to say anything.
Okay, let me mute you now, and before I go to other people, let me ask you this question, Hillary. What would you say if at a later date she came back to you, this woman, and said, "You knew, didn't you? You knew that he wasn't my father. Wait a minute. You might have thought that I had a very nice relationship with my father, but actually, I hated his guts, and he was horrible to me. And the only reason I was giving him a kidney was because he was my father, and I felt a duty to do so because he was my father. Had I known that he wasn't my father, I would have told him to get lost. And now I'm walking around with 1 kidney less. I've got a scar on my back, and I'm going to sue the transplant team for all those things. So that's what I would suggest.
I still say the same thing.
But your job, Johnny, as a doctor at that point, your job would have been to save a life, wouldn't it? So if she hadn't have said, if she'd said no, he would have died, maybe.
Okay, so what? If she'd have said, no, you can't do it against her will, Jonathan.
No, but is there a moral obligation as far as the hospital are concerned, who've tested her, right, to actually have to tell her,
Okay,
guess what? This is not your father, because they didn't test her for that originally.
Okay, that's the
So
dilemma.
is
That's
there-
the dilemma. Okay,
what
so
is-
that's the dilemma. So Howard says it's a no-brainer one way. Hillary says it's a no-brainer the other way. Who else would like to weigh in on this? Phyllis. Phyllis has got her hand up. Then Phyllis and then Paul. Phyllis, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So we tended in both cases to be inclined to truth-telling, unless there were very strong mitigating factors, and of course allowing discussing how it would be told, the preparation for telling, who would be, how this. We had to make some assumption that was a given, that this truth-telling would come at the highest professional standards. But
Okay, that's a
to
fair
get back to
assumption.
the case we just spoke about, yeah, well, that, otherwise, then it's even hard to discuss whether you should tell the truth or not.
That's
So,
a fair
in other words,
assumption. Phyllis, that's a fair assumption that the truth-telling would be done to the highest possible standard. Yes.
Yeah, and with the second case, we began actually with the view that Hillary just presented, that it was peripheral to the transplant, and we began by not being sure that it was necessarily relevant or the responsibility or even correct for the doctor to offer that information. But we moved as ethical dilemmas go, and we kind of evolved with talking about the fact that the doctor now has information that could be relevant to her health. Father is certainly not a well man. It's important for people to know, as adopted children know, important for people to know the medical history of their parents, and she might make decisions about her own health based on incorrect information. So we sort of evolved again to truth telling.
Okay. Thank you for that summary.
There's an assumption, of course.
So thank you for that summary. I think that we've got the idea that you found it difficult to come to a decision, but you eventually did come to a decision. Paul Westbrook, what have you got to say?
Yeah, I mean, we had the same sort of discussions, and we were marginally in favour of withholding the information because of the possible damage to relationship. But we also felt that there was a danger of that they wouldn't be able to check with her real father, genetic father, as to whether she had any reasons not to transplant, any medical reasons not to transplant. The other issue was sort of covered was if you tell the truth, or if you examine the consequences on the Jewish point of view, there might be an issue of mamzerut if she's a child of an illicit relationship that she didn't know about. In this case, her parents weren't married at the time, but nevertheless, she might be deemed to be a mamzer or mamzera because of this revelation, and whether that should be brought out or not. That was an issue. And finally, don't forget the immortal words of Monty Python in relation to Kant. Immanuel Kant was a real pissant who was very rarely stable.
Thank you. I never thought about the mamzerut issue, I have to say, but that's an interesting idea. I need to think about that. The bottom line, I think, will be that she has cheskat kashrut, and unless we know for sure that she's a mamzeret, then she won't be one. But thank you for raising that. That's an interesting point. Howard has sent a message, ever the lawyer, that says consent is consent. You can't do anything without consent, and there she has to sign up beforehand. So yeah, from a legal point of view, probably right, Howard. But we're discussing ethics, not necessarily always the legal side of things. Anybody else like to say anything before I read you something? Yes, Vivian.
Hi. So we were in Howard's group, and it was fascinating because on this case, I started off saying, just to shake it up a bit, so who benefits from telling the truth? But in our modern day and age, where lawyers, you know, that the law now will be so contentious and the claims could be so huge that we ended up coming down on the side of, yeah, you have to tell them.
Right, but you're not sure who's going to benefit. Well, the problem is that you don't know, do you? Because what you don't know is what's going on underneath the surface. How do you know that she would agree to have the operation unless if she was told that piece of information? So I don't think that you can say that nobody would benefit from it because we don't know enough about it. What I said to one of the groups which I joined was that because of a case like this, the protocols for the workup for transplants now include a discussion about this very thing. So in other words, when you go to before you get to the consent stage, and before you get to the testing stage, you're now told, now we're going to do some tests. These tests are not designed to test paternity. They're designed to see whether you are a match. However, it may come out, we may find out that you are not that you are not your father's daughter. If we were to find that out, would you want us to tell you? And thereby you sort out your problem. And of course, that is what is now in the workup for this because of a case like this. So that actually you do know whether they want to know or not. And that is a very, very important point, because if they do want to know and you don't tell them, you're wrong. And if they don't want to know and you do tell them, you're wrong. So in other words, this is one of those cases where you can only really be wrong. Now, let me just read to you before we finish. Let me just read to you what Sokol, who wrote up this case. It was a real case, but he wrote it up in a journal. I'm going to share the screen with you just so that you can see it. I hope you can see that. Can you see the screen? It's got lots of writing on it. Yeah, can you see it? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah. So he says, look at this. So which of the horn of the dilemma would I choose and why? I confess that I have struggled for the past 2 years over this case. Now, this is a guy who is a guy who's used to dealing with ethical problems. And he says it's taken him 2 years. I wavered on the relative weight that should be given to the principle of respect for autonomy. Depending on my mood, I opted for disclosure when I gave the principle significant moral weight and opted against it when I gave it a lower priority. In my current phase, no doubt biased by my fickle belief that I would not want to know myself, I would reluctantly choose the non-disclosure horn based mainly on the potential detrimental effects of disclosure on the patients. So I'm not going to read the rest of it to you, but basically what he says there is very clear, that he, Sokol, the guy who's writing this as the expert, does not know the answer because there isn't an answer. The answer is that you have to do your best. You have to weigh up the possibilities, and to the best of your ability, you have to decide which is the worst, no, which is the best of the bad options. Okay, they're both bad options because whichever way you do it, you've got a potential problem. And as he says, it's very, very carefully balanced. And he says, it took me 2 years and I'm fickle. I keep changing my mind. And the reason for that is that it's a very, very difficult thing. And what it demonstrates to us is the kind of things, okay, this is not the kind of thing that comes up every day, but nevertheless, it tells us and it shows us how carefully we have to weigh things. And I think that the Jewish view here would probably be towards non-disclosure. If I had to paskin halacha, thankfully I don't, But if I did, well, first of all, I'd ring up Professor Abraham and ask him what he wanted, what he said I should do. But assuming I couldn't get through and it was down to me, I think that I would choose non-disclosure on the basis that of what he said here, is that probably disclosure is going to open up the floodgates. Remember, those of you who are in our Gemara Shir, I'll remind you of it tomorrow. What's the expression? Poter mayim reshit madon. Once you open up the water, you have no idea where it's going to go. You can't control it. That's talking about arguments, as we know from our Gemara Shir. But this is the same information. You let this information out, you don't know where it's going to lead you. So if it was me, I think that I would choose non-disclosure and hope that she would not come back and sue me later on. Howard, of course, would not do any such thing. He thinks it's a no-brainer and he would get consent before he did anything at all. And he would face the consequences of a broken family and father and daughter never speaking to one another, and all those things that might be the responsibility of telling them. It's a very difficult dilemma. I'm going to leave that with you now to discuss it on your own. It's 10:10. It's time for a cup of tea at least. I shall wish you a good night and I'll see you next week.
Good night. Thank you.
Anyone who has any further comments or questions, feel free to email them to Avril and she will pass them on. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Wonderful evening.
Thank you. Very, very good.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Good night. It was very good.
Good night. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Positive from what?
This is Johnny Brown. Thank you.